The night had barely ended inside the arena, but the backstage area still pulsed with a heavy, uneasy energy. The crowd's roar had faded, replaced by the hum of lighting rigs and the clatter of production crates being wheeled away. Amid the organized chaos, one moment from earlier in the show still echoed through every corridor: Paul Heyman's declaration that Brock Lesnar, the Beast incarnate himself, was now the official leader of the Vision. The news had spread like wildfire. Some whispered it, some said it out loud with disbelief, and some refused to believe it at all. But no one reacted more sharply than Bronson Reed. His massive frame moved through the dim corridors like a storm barely contained. Every worker who crossed his path sensed the tension radiating off him, thick, suffocating, and dangerous. Reed had fought tooth and nail for respect since the inception of the Vision. When Seth Rollins first introduced the concept, a brotherhood of wrestlers united by dominance and precision, Bronson had been the enforcer, the hammer that made Rollins' ideas real. After Rollins' downfall and eventual relinquishment of his championship, Reed had silently assumed he'd be the natural successor. He was, after all, the muscle that held everything together when others fled. But tonight, Heyman's words had shattered that belief. Behind the cameras, Paul's smug grin and the signature cadence of his voice had set the stage for something monumental. The new era of the Vision, he called it. The new leader, he said, was not just a strategist but a predator. Then came that chilling introduction: Brock Lesnar walking through the smoke with a slow, confident stride, the crowd erupting in disbelief and awe. Reed had stood backstage, watching on the monitor, his jaw tight, his arms folded over his chest. Every muscle in his body flexed with frustration. To him, it wasn't just about leadership. It was about betrayal, about being replaced by someone who didn't bleed for the group, someone who wasn't there when the Vision fell apart. Now, as the night deepened, that resentment burned hotter. The production crew gave him space, sensing the storm that was coming. Reed's boots echoed against the concrete floor as he turned corners, each step heavier than the last. He didn't need to speak, his expression said everything. His eyes had that cold, dangerous calm, the kind that came before violence. In another part of the backstage area, Brock Lesnar was calmly changing out of his in-ring gear. The locker room was quiet except for the faint hum of an air vent and the sound of Brock's breathing. Despite the chaos outside, he was composed, as if he had been waiting for this moment. For Brock, leadership was not something he chased, it was something that naturally bent toward him. Wherever he went, dominance followed. Paul Heyman hovered nearby, still buzzing with satisfaction. He adjusted his tie, glancing at his phone every few seconds as messages poured in. The Vision, now under Brock's control, was the biggest power move Heyman had orchestrated since his days managing the Bloodline. But even Heyman, with all his cunning, could sense that trouble was brewing. He had seen Bronson's face earlier. That glare. That wounded pride. And Heyman knew, a man like Bronson Reed didn't just accept betrayal quietly. Back near the catering area, Reed stopped walking. He leaned against a wall, his massive hands tightening into fists. The veins in his forearms pulsed as he replayed the announcement in his mind. The memory was vivid: the crowd's roar, Paul's smirk, Brock's entrance. It wasn't just anger that consumed him, it was humiliation. To be treated like an expendable soldier in a group he helped build was an insult he couldn't tolerate. Security guards exchanged glances nearby, whispering under their breath. They knew that look. The kind of look that usually ended with shattered equipment and emergency calls to management. But none of them dared approach. Reed's silence was more threatening than any outburst. In the locker room, Brock strapped his duffel bag and adjusted his jacket. He didn't look at the door when it opened, he already knew who was standing there. The silence that filled the room was deafening. A faint creak of the door, then heavy footsteps. The air thickened instantly. Bronson stepped inside, his eyes locked on Brock like a predator spotting another alpha in its territory. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The room's temperature seemed to drop as both men stood still, a wall of tension between them that could shatter at any second. Paul Heyman, sensing the invisible electricity, stepped back. His smirk faltered just slightly. He had seen Lesnar face down giants before, but this was different. This was personal, primal, and unpredictable. Reed wasn't intimidated. He wasn't a challenger seeking approval, he was a rival ready to tear everything apart to reclaim what he believed was his. The standoff stretched on for what felt like minutes. Neither moved. The only sound was the faint buzz of a flickering fluorescent light above them. Reed's shoulders rose and fell with deep, steady breaths, while Brock's icy stare remained unbroken. In that moment, it was clear, the vision wasn't big enough for both of them. Reed finally turned his head slightly, scanning the walls covered with photos of the vision's rise, Rollins standing with his followers, Paul in the background orchestrating every move. His jaw clenched tighter. Those images were a reminder of everything he'd done, everything he'd fought for. And now, those memories were being rewritten with Brock Lesnar as the face of it all. Brock finally moved, setting his bag on the bench with a deliberate thud. His presence alone seemed to command silence, even from the walls themselves. The tension between the two men wasn't just about leadership, it was about dominance, territory, and legacy. As the camera crew lingered outside the door, trying to capture glimpses through a small crack, Heyman gestured sharply for them to leave. He didn't want this recorded. What was about to happen wasn't meant for television, it was a war between egos too massive for the lens to contain. Reed took a slow step forward, his boots echoing across the floor. Brock didn't flinch. Their eyes locked once again, two forces of nature, immovable and unyielding. If the ring had been their battlefield, this was their silent arena. The room felt smaller with every passing second. The silence that hung between Bronson Reed and Brock Lesnar felt almost supernatural, a heavy, invisible fog pressing against every wall of the locker room. Paul Heyman's nervous breathing was the only sound that dared to break the stillness. Both men remained still, but the tension was so palpable it might as well have been a full-blown brawl already. Bronson's jaw flexed again, his chest expanding and contracting in slow, deep breaths. He looked down briefly, staring at the tiled floor beneath his boots, not in submission, but in control. He was keeping himself contained, wrestling with the storm building inside him. Brock, on the other hand, was the embodiment of calm aggression. His posture was relaxed, but his presence was suffocating. Heyman, caught between them, shifted nervously. His mind raced, 1,000 scenarios flashing before him. He had orchestrated this alliance to strengthen the vision, not to ignite civil war within it. But he knew both men too well. Bronson Reed didn't yield. Brock Lesnar didn't tolerate defiance. One spark was all it would take to turn this into destruction. Reed's eyes flicked toward Brock's duffel bag. His gaze lingered there, then slowly rose back up. The beast's stare didn't move. Their unspoken communication was primal, dominance, territory, hierarchy. For a split second, it wasn't about the vision, Paul Heyman, or WWE. It was about two apex predators deciding who had the right to breathe in that room. Outside the locker room, tension seeped through the walls. Wrestlers walked by slower than usual, pretending to check their phones but clearly aware of what was happening inside. Word had spread, Brock and Bronson were face to face, and something bad was coming. Reed took a single step forward. His boots echoed like gunfire. The veins in his neck bulged as his fists tightened again. The entire room seemed to tilt toward chaos. Brock's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly, the same way a lion might look when another animal dares to invade its space. Heyman swallowed hard. He could almost feel the collision coming. Reed's massive frame loomed over Lesnar's, yet somehow, Brock's stillness made him appear larger. The difference between them wasn't just in reputation, it was in the energy they carried. Lesnar had built his entire career on instilling fear, but Reed was different. He didn't fear him. If anything, he looked almost eager to see what would happen if this standoff finally broke. And then, it did. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was almost surgical in its suddenness. Bronson shifted his weight slightly, bumping Brock's shoulder as he turned to leave, a deliberate move, a silent declaration of defiance. The sound of impact, shoulder on shoulder, echoed sharply in the confined space. Brock's reaction was instant, animalistic. The calm was gone in an instant. His hand shot out, gripping Reed by the back of the neck. The movement was quick, brutal, and instinctive, like a predator striking before its prey could even think. Reed didn't flinch, instead, he pivoted sharply, breaking free with surprising speed for a man his size. The impact sent Brock back half a step. The room exploded with energy. Benches scraped against the walls, lockers rattled, and Heyman stumbled backward, hands raised in panic. Brock's stare hardened into pure aggression. Reed stood tall, unmoving. Their chests heaved, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer intensity of adrenaline. It was the kind of moment that couldn't be scripted, couldn't be rehearsed, a flashpoint that existed beyond words. Security didn't rush in, not yet. No one wanted to be the first to step between two monsters like this. Reed's breathing deepened, his shoulders squared, his body lowering slightly, ready to strike. Brock tilted his head just enough to send a message, "Try it." They circled each other slowly, the air crackling with violence barely restrained. Neither blinked. Every muscle in their bodies was alive, prepared to explode at any second. Then, without warning, Brock lunged. The sound of the collision was thunderous, two giants clashing with primal force. The walls shook. Equipment crashed to the floor. Heyman shouted something unintelligible, but his voice was drowned by the chaos. Reed slammed into Brock with pure fury, driving him backward into the row of lockers. Metal groaned and bent under the impact. Brock retaliated instantly, grabbing Reed around the waist and driving him toward the center of the room. The two titans collided again, sending debris scattering across the floor. Neither man gained a clear advantage, it was brute strength versus brute strength, a pure contest of willpower and dominance. Reed shoved Brock off him with a roar that shook the room. Sweat rolled down his forehead as he squared up again. Brock cracked his neck, that dangerous smirk forming for just a heartbeat, not out of mockery, but out of recognition. For the first time in a long time, someone had matched him hit for hit. Heyman's face was pale. His dream of an unstoppable vision led by Brock Lesnar was collapsing before his eyes. The backstage crew had gathered outside the door now, whispering and recording with hidden phones. What had started as silent tension was now a physical storm shaking the foundations of the vision itself. Reed lunged again, but this time Brock sidestepped, catching him in a clinch and driving a knee toward his midsection. The sound was dull and heavy, but Reed absorbed it, shoving Lesnar back with raw fury. They were evenly matched, two forces refusing to yield. The room was chaos incarnate. At that moment, Triple H appeared at the far end of the hallway, alerted by panicked staff. His expression was stone. He didn't rush, he never did, but his presence alone made the crowd outside part like water. He stood in silence for a moment, watching through the narrow crack in the door. Inside, Brock and Bronson stood again, separated now by the wreckage of what used to be the locker bench. Both were breathing hard, eyes still locked, neither backing down. Heyman, trembling, moved between them, his hands raised, his voice cracking. His words didn't matter. Both men ignored him completely. Triple H finally stepped inside, the sound of his boots cutting through the tension. He didn't speak. His eyes moved from Brock to Reed, then back to Brock again. The destruction around them said everything. The vision, which was supposed to represent unity and power, had turned into a battlefield of ego and dominance. Reed's chest was still heaving. Sweat trickled down his temple. Brock wiped blood from his lip, unbothered, and turned away, picking up his bag like nothing had happened. That was Lesnar's way, violence was routine, almost casual. He didn't see this as rebellion. He saw it as natural order asserting itself. Reed, however, didn't move. His glare followed Brock until he was out the door. Every muscle in his body screamed to continue the fight, but he stayed still, not out of fear, but because he had already made his statement. The vision wasn't Brock's to command. Not yet. Triple H's voice finally broke the silence, calm but heavy with authority. The crew couldn't hear the words, but the look he gave Heyman said it all: "Control your men or I will." Heyman nodded silently, sweat glistening on his forehead. He knew the fallout would be bad. The cameras outside had likely caught more than enough to fuel speculation for weeks. And inside the Vision, the fracture had now become irreversible. Brock left the room without a backward glance, his boots echoing down the corridor. The Beast had made his statement through dominance, not words. Bronson remained behind, standing amid the wreckage, his fists slowly unclenching. His breathing steadied, but his eyes burned with something deeper: resolve. The war wasn't over. It was only beginning. As Brock's figure disappeared into the distance, Paul turned back toward Reed. For a brief second, their eyes met. The manipulator and the betrayed. Heyman opened his mouth to speak, but Reed simply stared through him, unmoving. Then, without a sound, he turned and left the room, leaving the chaos behind. Triple H watched him go, his mind already turning. He could sense where this was heading: a collision on live television, a power struggle too big to contain backstage. And somewhere, in the shadows of the hallway, a camera light flicked off. Someone had been filming everything.